He lived on the edge of a small town that most people just passed through without noticing. The kind of town where time seemed to move slower, and everyone knew what their neighbor had for breakfast. People saw him sometimes, walking early in the morning, always in the same calm rhythm, his posture straight and quiet. He looked like someone who didn't need to prove anything to anyone. He lived alone except for his dog. The dog was everything to him. A tall, black and tan Belgian Malinois with eyes that always looked alert yet calm. The man called him Shadow. Wherever he went, Shadow followed. They were like one person in two bodies, connected in a way words couldn't explain. In the quiet of the morning, when the mist still floated above the grass, they would walk together. The dog's paws barely made a sound. The man didn't speak much, but when he did, it was always gentle, always with purpose. To the people in town, he was a mystery. He had moved there 3 years ago, bought a small piece of land on the outskirts and kept mostly to himself. Some said he had been in the military. Others thought he had worked in security or law enforcement. Nobody really knew, and he never talked about it. He just lived quietly, taking care of his home and his dog. He woke up before the sun as if his body still followed an invisible routine from another life. He would start the day with a run, 5 miles, sometimes more. Shadow ran beside him, never pulling on the leash, never lagging behind. The man never needed to tell him what to do. One look was enough. They understood each other. After the run, he would make a small breakfast, feed Shadow, and then spend time repairing something around the house. He had built most of the furniture himself. The tools in his shed were always neatly arranged. Everything had a place, everything had a purpose. He liked it that way. It gave him peace. Sometimes, when he sat on his porch with a cup of coffee, he would stare into the distance and drift into memories that no one else could see. There was a heaviness behind his calm expression, like someone who had seen too much but didn't want to burden anyone with it. Shadow would lie beside him, head resting on his boots as if keeping him anchored to the present. The people in town were friendly, but cautious around strangers. Some respected his privacy. Others whispered stories about him. "He's got that military walk," one neighbor once said. "You can tell he's seen some things." Another nodded and added, "He's polite, but there's something in his eyes. Like he's still watching something only he can see." He didn't mind the talk. He'd learned long ago that people will always make up stories to fill the gaps in what they don't understand. As long as they left him and Shadow alone, he was fine. One afternoon, while buying supplies from the local hardware store, the young cashier tried to start a conversation. She was curious, maybe a little nervous. "You always come in for wood and metal parts," she said. "Are you building something big?" He smiled faintly. "Just fixing things," he said. "It keeps me busy." She laughed softly, trying to get more out of him. "You must really like working with your hands." He looked at her kindly, though his eyes seemed to look past the moment. "It's good to keep them busy," he said. "Idle hands remember too much." She didn't understand what he meant, but she nodded anyway. That was how he lived. Calm, disciplined, detached from the noise of the world. His dog was the only one who saw his real side. At night, when the nightmares came, Shadow would nudge him awake before he even started to thrash or sweat. The dog seemed to sense it before it began. The man would wake, breathe deeply, and rest his hand on Shadow's back until the shaking stopped. That bond was more than companionship. It was survival. He never bragged, never talked about who he had been. But inside, he carried the memories of a lifetime in service, a life built on discipline, danger, and silence. He had been part of something few people knew existed, something that required him to disappear from the world even when he was standing in it. That was before. Now he just wanted peace. His house was simple. 2 rooms, wooden floors, a small kitchen, and shelves lined with books that looked worn from years of use. Most of the titles were about philosophy, survival, and history. On one shelf sat a small framed photograph. It showed a group of men in camouflage uniforms standing together in a desert. Their faces were tired but proud. One of them was him, younger, harder in the eyes. That picture never moved from the shelf. It was both a memory and a warning, a reminder of everything he had left behind. Every morning, Shadow would sit by the door, waiting for the signal to go outside. The man would tie his boots, put on his worn cap, and open the door. "Let's go," he would say quietly, and Shadow would leap into motion, tail wagging with silent energy. They would walk through the fields behind the house, sometimes down to the river that ran slow and calm. The air there was always cooler. Sometimes he would throw a stick, and Shadow would fetch it with precision, returning it to his hand like a soldier reporting back. Other times he would just sit on a rock and watch the water while Shadow lay close by, his ears twitching at the sounds of nature. Those moments were his peace. The world outside could argue, fight, and spin in chaos. He didn't want any part of it anymore. He had done his time. He had seen enough of what people were capable of when fear and power collided. He wanted quiet now, and Shadow gave him that. But peace, as he had learned many times before, never lasts forever. The first signs of trouble were small, almost invisible. A new neighbor had moved into the area, a family with 2 loud dogs that barked at everything. Shadow, trained for discipline, never barked back, but the noise sometimes got to him. One morning, when they were walking near the edge of the property, the neighbor's dog started barking wildly. The man turned calmly and walked the other way, keeping Shadow close. But one of the neighbors thought he was being rude and unfriendly. Word spread that he was cold, that he didn't like people. A few days later, another misunderstanding happened. One of the neighbor's kids threw a ball that landed near his fence. Shadow, alert but not aggressive, stood by the gate watching the child approach. The kid hesitated, saw the size of the dog, and ran back home crying. The parents called the authorities, saying there was a dangerous dog on the property. The man didn't know about the complaint at first. He just noticed 2 police cars drive past his house one afternoon, slowing down as they looked at his yard. Shadow stood beside him, quiet as always. He didn't think much of it, but something inside him, an old instinct, tightened. He had spent years reading situations before they happened. Something about the way the cars lingered told him this wasn't the end of it. That evening, as the sun began to set, he sat on the porch again, Shadow's head resting on his lap. The air smelled like rain. He watched the sky turn orange, then red, then fade into darkness. The stillness reminded him of waiting before a mission, when silence carried more weight than sound. He whispered to Shadow, "You and me, that's all we need." The dog lifted his head and looked up at him as if he understood every word. Inside, he checked the doors and windows like he always did. It wasn't fear, it was habit. A habit that had been trained into him over years of surviving situations most people couldn't imagine. Everything had to be secure. Every exit had to be known. It was part of who he was. As the night grew deeper, he sat by the window and watched the world outside go dark. A storm rolled in, bringing rain that hit the roof in steady rhythm. Shadow slept near the door, his breathing calm and steady. The man's eyes grew heavy, but his mind stayed alert. He didn't know why, but something about the day felt unfinished. He finally went to bed, the kind of sleep that's light enough to wake at any sound. And just before dawn, he dreamed again. Those old memories, the ones he tried to bury. The noise of helicopters, the sound of gunfire, the feeling of sand burning his skin, the cries of people he couldn't save. He woke up sweating, breathing fast. Shadow was already at his side, nudging him gently. "It's okay," he whispered, his hand resting on the dog's head. "It's over." But deep inside, he knew it was never really over. When morning came, he brewed his coffee, opened the window, and took a long breath of fresh air. The storm had cleared, leaving the world bright and clean. He took it as a sign to move on with the day. He didn't know that his quiet routine, his peace with Shadow, was about to collide with the world he had tried to leave behind. Sometimes life waits until you finally find peace before it tests you again. That morning felt normal. The sky was clear, the air crisp, and the fields shimmered with dew. He and Shadow went for their usual run. Everything felt ordinary, almost too calm. But in the distance, a pair of unfamiliar cars rolled slowly through town, their radios buzzing softly. They were heading in his direction. He didn't see them yet. He just ran, free and focused, the sound of his dog's paws matching the rhythm of his heartbeat. He didn't know that this day, the day that began like any other, would become the day everything changed. The town would remember it, though not for what really happened, because most people never see the truth. They only see what they are told. And what happened next would test not only his patience and discipline, but everything he had learned about control, justice, and forgiveness. The next morning started just like every other. The man tied his boots, poured a cup of coffee, and called his dog. The air was cool and smelled like wet grass after the rain. The sky was bright, and the road in front of his house was quiet. It was the kind of morning that made him believe maybe peace was possible after all. He didn't know that peace was already slipping away, quietly and slowly, like a shadow at sunrise. He walked with his dog down the trail that ran behind his property. It was a simple routine, one that grounded him. He didn't check his phone, didn't think about the world beyond the trees. He liked the sound of the wind, the chirping of the birds, and the crunch of gravel beneath his boots. His dog moved beside him, tail up, ears alert but calm. They didn't need words. Their silence was a language of its own. Halfway through the walk, his dog suddenly stopped and looked toward the road. The man followed his gaze and saw a white truck parked near the edge of his property. Two men stood by it, one holding a clipboard. They looked like local authorities. He didn't think much of it. Maybe it was some kind of inspection or road work. He walked back home slowly, watching the truck from a distance. The men didn't approach, but they took notes, glanced toward his yard, and then drove away. Something about it made him uneasy. Old instincts, the kind that had kept him alive in other lives, whispered that something wasn't right. He tried to ignore it. He made breakfast, fed his dog, and sat on the porch as usual. But the thought stayed with him like a small weight pressing on his chest. He didn't know that the complaint from his neighbor had started a small chain of events that would bring strangers to his quiet home, with judgment already formed in their minds. Later that day, while he was repairing a section of his fence, a county vehicle pulled into his driveway. A woman stepped out, dressed neatly, holding a notepad. Her tone was polite but official. "Good afternoon, sir," she said. "We received a report about an aggressive dog in the area. Would you mind if I ask a few questions?" He looked at her calmly. "You can ask," he said, "but you won't find an aggressive dog here." His dog sat by his side, silent, eyes steady. The woman kept her distance but watched closely. She scribbled something down and asked, "Has your dog ever left your property?" "Never without me," he said. "He's trained. May I approach him?" she asked. "You can try," he said. "He won't hurt you." She stepped forward slowly. The dog didn't move. He just sat there, tail still, eyes following her every step. She smiled nervously. "He's well behaved," she admitted. "He's disciplined," the man corrected. "There's a difference." She nodded and made a few more notes. "We'll close the file after inspection," she said, sounding relieved. Then she left. He watched her drive away, hoping that was the end of it. But deep down he knew better. When authority gets a taste of curiosity, it rarely stops at one visit. For the next few days, life returned to its slow rhythm. He trained his dog like always. Simple commands, focused movements, quiet obedience. The dog loved the work. It wasn't about control. It was about connection. The man found peace in those hours, knowing that discipline could be a form of love. One afternoon, a few kids from the nearby neighborhood rode their bikes past his house. They waved and called out greetings. He waved back, smiling a little. It felt good to be seen as just another neighbor for once. His dog watched quietly, tail wagging slightly. But one of the kids shouted, "That's the big scary dog," and laughed. The others laughed too. He didn't take offense. Kids repeat what they hear at home. That night, he sat by the fireplace listening to soft music. His dog rested at his feet. The flickering light painted the room in warm colors. It felt peaceful. He thought about calling an old friend, one of the few who knew who he used to be. But he changed his mind. The past had already taken enough from him. He wanted to leave it buried, at least for tonight. Then came the knock on the door. It was firm, official. He opened it slowly. Two uniformed officers stood outside. Their flashlights cut through the dim light. "Evening, sir," one said. "We're following up on a complaint. Someone reported a possible dangerous animal on this property." He looked at them, calm but tired. "You've been misinformed," he said. "My dog's not dangerous. We just need to take a look," the officer said. He nodded. "All right. But stay calm." He responds to my voice. He stepped aside. His dog was inside, sitting by the doorway, watching silently. The officers tensed up a little. The man gave a quiet command, and the dog sat perfectly still. He spoke softly. "You see? He's not the problem." But one of the officers seemed uneasy. He whispered something to his partner. The man caught the glance. They didn't see a pet. They saw a threat. He knew that look. He had seen it in too many faces before, fear dressed as authority. The second officer asked a few questions, took a few photos, then said they'd file a report. When they left, the man stood in silence for a long time. He looked down at his dog and said quietly, "They don't understand you." The dog rested his head on his knee, as if saying he understood enough. The days that followed were restless. He noticed more cars driving slowly past his house. Sometimes they stopped. Sometimes he saw phone cameras flash from a distance. He didn't react. Reacting only made things worse. He had learned that lesson the hard way long ago. Still, the feeling of being watched brought back old instincts. He cleaned up his yard, made sure everything was in order. He didn't want to give anyone an excuse to bother him again. But the situation took a turn one morning when a letter arrived in his mailbox. It was from the county office saying an inspection would be scheduled to evaluate animal safety compliance. He sighed. It felt like being back in a mission where bureaucracy replaced bullets. Different battlefield, same kind of misunderstanding. He didn't tell anyone. He just prepared. He made sure his dog's records were ready. Vaccinations, licenses, everything. He even printed training certifications from years ago. Proof that the dog was professionally trained. He didn't like being judged, but he believed in doing things right. The day of the inspection, 2 new officers arrived. Different faces this time. They were polite at first, asking routine questions. But their tone shifted when the dog barked once, reacting to a car door slamming outside. "See?" one of them said quickly. "That's aggressive behavior." "It's alertness," the man replied, keeping his voice calm. He heard a sound. That's all. They wrote something down. He could tell their minds were already made up. No matter what he said, they saw what they wanted to see. The visit ended without conflict, but something about it felt unfinished. That evening, he walked to the edge of town to clear his head. The sun dipped low, casting long shadows across the ground. He thought about how simple his life had been before all this. Now it felt like the world was creeping back in, testing his patience, pushing old wounds. When he returned home, his dog greeted him with a wagging tail. He smiled faintly, crouching down to scratch behind his ears. "You're the only one who gets it," he said softly. The dog leaned into his hand, warm and steady. That moment of quiet connection was all he needed to feel centered again. But fate, as always, has a way of turning peace into trials. The next morning, when he stepped outside for his usual walk, there were 3 vehicles parked near his gate. Uniformed officers stood beside them. One of them held papers. He stopped walking, the dog still at his heel, perfectly calm but alert. The officer raised a hand. "Sir, we need to speak with you about a serious complaint." The man's heart sank. He didn't know what they were about to say, but he could already feel the weight of misunderstanding pressing down on him. He looked at his dog and then back at the officers. "All right," he said quietly. "Let's talk." And with that, the stillness of his quiet life began to crumble. The morning air felt heavier than usual. The man stood quietly, looking at the officers near his gate. His dog stayed close beside him, tail still, head slightly tilted. The man's calmness was not an act. It was who he had become after years of learning that losing your temper never helped anything. Still, there was a quiet tension in his eyes, the kind that came from knowing when things were about to turn complicated. "Sir," one of the officers said, unfolding a few papers, "we received another report from a neighbor about your dog. They claim it's been acting aggressively and that it may pose a danger to the community." The man didn't move. His voice was low but steady. "He hasn't left this property. He doesn't bark at people. He's not dangerous." The officer nodded slightly but didn't seem convinced. "We understand, but we still need to take a look, maybe observe his behavior." He hesitated. He didn't like strangers coming near his dog, but he also knew refusing would only make things worse. So he opened the gate slowly and said, "Stay calm. He'll follow my lead." The officers entered cautiously. His dog stood perfectly still, eyes moving from one man to another, not aggressive, just alert. One of the officers made a note on his clipboard. "He's trained," the man said quietly. "He understands commands better than most people I know." The officer looked at him for a moment, trying to read his tone. "You've done a good job with him," he said, though it sounded more like formality than praise. The inspection didn't take long. They checked the fence, looked at the dog's paperwork, asked a few questions about feeding and training. Then one officer said something that made the man's heart tighten slightly. "If any more complaints come in, we'll have to take further steps." Just to be clear, he didn't argue. He only nodded. "Understood." After they left, the man walked back to the porch and sat down. His dog rested beside him, head on his boots, eyes soft. For a long time, he said nothing. He watched the officers' vehicles disappear down the road, the dust floating in the air long after they were gone. He whispered, almost to himself, "It's never about the dog. It's about how people see what they don't understand." The next few days passed quietly, but not peacefully. He could feel eyes on him every time he went into town. People he once greeted with a nod now looked away, pretending to be busy. The cashier at the store who used to smile at him now spoke less, her voice careful, measured. Rumors travel fast in small towns, faster than truth ever could. Still, he kept his head down. He walked his dog early in the morning when the streets were empty. He fixed the fence again, not because it was broken, but because he needed something to do with his hands. The silence around him started to feel different, not peaceful anymore, but heavy. It was the kind of quiet that made you listen for trouble even when there was none. One afternoon, as he was cleaning the porch, a car stopped on the road. A man leaned out the window and shouted something about keeping dangerous dogs away from kids. The man didn't respond. He just stood there still and calm until the car drove off. His dog looked up at him, waiting for a signal, but he just shook his head. "Not worth it," he said softly. He knew confrontation never solved anything, but what hurt most was the unfairness of it all. He had lived a life of service, trained to protect people who would never even know his name, and now, in the quiet years he had fought so hard to earn, he was being treated like a problem. That night he couldn't sleep. He sat by the window watching the streetlights glow faintly through the mist. His dog lay near the door, as always. Every so often the dog would raise his head and glance at him, sensing his restlessness. He reached down, rubbed the dog's neck gently and said, "You did nothing wrong. Don't ever doubt that." Morning came again, too early and too bright. He tried to follow his routine, but something felt off. He couldn't shake the sense that something was building slowly and quietly behind the scenes. The kind of buildup that ends with someone knocking on your door again. And he was right. 3 days later, just before noon, 2 vehicles arrived once more. He was working in the shed when he heard the engines. He stepped out, wiping his hands on a rag. The same officers were back, this time with another man, someone who looked like a senior supervisor. The man's stance was confident, almost rehearsed. He held a clipboard and spoke firmly. "Sir, we've had multiple reports now. We need to ensure everyone's safety. This visit is part of a review process." The man's voice was calm. "You've been here. You've seen him. Nothing's changed." The supervisor looked down at his papers, avoiding eye contact. "We understand, but this is procedure. It's not personal." He smiled faintly, though it didn't reach his eyes. "It's always personal when it's about what you love." The supervisor didn't respond. He gave a short nod to the others, who began taking pictures again, of the fence, the yard, even the dog. The man stood quietly, letting them do what they came for. His dog sat by his leg, obedient as ever, not making a sound. After a few minutes, the supervisor stepped closer. "Sir, may I ask where you trained your dog? He seems unusually disciplined." The man's gaze softened slightly. "You could say he learned from my old life," he replied. "The one I don't talk about anymore." The supervisor gave a polite smile, not understanding the depth of that answer. He finished his inspection and left with the others. The man watched them go, standing still long after the sound of engines faded. That night he sat outside again, looking up at the sky. The stars were clear and the air was cool. His dog lay beside him, ears twitching at the soft sounds of the night. He thought about everything he'd lost before, the brothers in arms who never came back, the years that vanished in the silence of classified missions, the peace he had to build from scratch. And now even that fragile peace felt like it was being taken piece by piece. He knew one thing. He wouldn't let anger take over. He'd seen what anger could do to good people, but he also knew he couldn't stay silent forever. If people wanted to see a story, he would give them the truth, but in his own way, without rage, without hate. Just truth. A few days later, when he went into town to buy supplies, a local journalist approached him near his truck. She had heard the rumors, and something about the story didn't sit right with her. She asked gently, "Would you be open to telling your side of things? People only hear one version." He studied her face for a moment, unsure if he could trust her. Then he said quietly, "I don't want trouble. I just want peace." "I understand," she said, "but sometimes silence lets the wrong story win." He didn't answer right away. Her words stayed with him long after he drove home. That night, he thought about it again. Maybe it was time to let people know who he really was, not for pride, but for fairness. The next morning, he sat at his desk and opened an old drawer. Inside was a small stack of certificates, medals, and folded letters. He hadn't touched them in years. They were reminders of a life that most people couldn't imagine. He looked at the medals, not with pride, but with a quiet sadness. Every one of them had a cost. He placed them back, locked the drawer, and whispered, "You taught me how to fight. But this time, it's a different kind of battle." The following day, the journalist called again, asking if she could visit. He agreed hesitantly. When she arrived, his dog stayed close, watching carefully but calm. She sat on the porch, notebook in hand. "I just want to understand," she said softly. "People say things that don't match what I see." He told her a little about his dog, how they had trained together for years, how the dog had once served in operations that no one talked about publicly, and how they had both retired to find peace. He didn't name any details. He didn't need to. The way he spoke, slow and steady, carried truth. She listened carefully, her eyes widening slightly as she realized how wrong the rumors had been. When she asked why he never told anyone, he said simply, "Because peace doesn't need an audience." When she left, she thanked him. "I'll make sure people hear this," she promised. He nodded, but didn't expect much. People believed what fit their fears. Still, something about her sincerity gave him a small bit of hope. Days passed. Then one evening, a neighbor stopped by. Not the complaining one, but another who had read the journalist article online. He brought a small box of dog treats and said awkwardly, "Didn't know about all that. Guess people talk too much." The man smiled faintly. "They always do," he said. That small gesture meant more than he admitted. It was proof that truth could still reach people, even through the noise. For a moment, life felt a little lighter again. He thought maybe the worst was over. Maybe people would finally understand. But peace, as always, was fragile. And the world, as he had learned too many times before, has a way of testing even the calmest hearts. What happened next would show that not everyone was ready to let go of their fear. That night, he walked out to the porch one last time, feeling the cool wind brush against his face. His dog sat beside him, eyes reflecting the faint glow of the porch light. He whispered softly, "We've come through worse, haven't we?" The dog looked up, tail moving once, slow and steady. The man smiled faintly, but somewhere beyond the quiet road, unseen plans were already moving. And the peace he fought so hard to protect was about to be tested again, this time in a way that would reach far beyond his little town. The morning after the article came out, the small town felt different. People were reading, talking, and sharing things they had never cared to ask before. Some were surprised. Others were doubtful. A few were angry. But the story had started moving, and there was no way to stop it now. The man stayed quiet through it all. He didn't go to town, didn't answer calls, and didn't open the gate unless he knew who was outside. His dog stayed close, sensing his unease. They had both lived through worse storms, but this one was different. It wasn't about survival this time, it was about truth, and how much the world could twist it. Evening after evening, he watched the horizon from his porch, waiting for calm that didn't come. 2 days later, the journalist called again. "It's spreading fast," she said. "Veterans from all over are commenting, sending messages. Some of them say they served with you." He said nothing for a long moment. "I didn't think anyone would remember," he finally replied. "They remember," she said softly. "And they're angry about what's been done to you." He wasn't sure how to feel about that. He had spent his whole life avoiding attention. Now it was finding him anyway. By the weekend, news outlets outside the town had picked up the story. Some of them got it right, most didn't. They used dramatic headlines and old photos without permission. They spoke of heroism and injustice, but to him it felt distant, like they were talking about someone else. He didn't want fame. He just wanted fairness. When he finally went into town again, people stared but didn't look away this time. A few nodded respectfully. The cashier spoke softly, almost apologetically, when she handed him his receipt. "Didn't know the whole story," she said. "I'm sorry for how people treated you." He smiled faintly. "You don't owe me an apology," he said. "We all see what we're ready to see." Outside, he noticed something that made him pause. Someone had left a small flag near his gate, folded neatly, with a note that read, "Thank you for your service." He stood there for a long moment, then picked it up and placed it carefully on the porch railing. He didn't know who left it, but it meant something. Quiet, honest recognition. But not everyone felt that way. Late one night, a car slowed down near his property. The driver shouted something about fake heroes and sped off. The man didn't chase, didn't react. He just looked at the taillights fading into the dark. His dog stood beside him, ears perked, muscles tense. "Easy," he whispered. Some people don't understand peace until they break it. He turned back inside, but he could feel the old instincts rising again, the kind that never really leave a soldier. He checked the locks, scanned the yard with a flashlight, and listened to the silence. It wasn't fear, it was habit. The same calm readiness that had once kept him alive now reminded him that even peace requires vigilance. The next morning, his phone rang again. It was the journalist. Her tone was more serious this time. "The police department's making a statement today," she said. "They're trying to defend what happened. They're saying you refused to cooperate, that your dog was aggressive." He sighed quietly. "Of course they are." "I'm going to publish the recordings," she said quickly. "The interview, the photos, the reports. People should see the truth." He hesitated. "Make sure it doesn't turn into hate," he said. "That's not what this is for." "I promise," she said. "This is about accountability, not anger." By noon, the news story was everywhere. The journalist released her findings, complete with witness statements and the old service records that confirmed who he was. People began to realize the depth of what had happened, not just to a man and his dog, but to a symbol of loyalty and sacrifice. Messages of support came in from all over. Former teammates, commanders, and families of soldiers sent words of encouragement. He read some of them in silence, then turned off his phone. Gratitude was heavy too. That evening, a local news van stopped near his driveway. The reporter wanted an interview. He refused politely, saying, "The story isn't about me, it's about what people need to remember." Still, they filmed from the road, showing the quiet house and the flag fluttering gently on the porch. To the viewers, it looked peaceful. To him, it was a battlefield of memory. In the following days, the town started to change. Neighbors who had kept their distance now stopped to wave. Some brought food or flowers. A few even offered to help repair parts of the fence that didn't need fixing. He accepted their kindness not because he needed it, but because it reminded him that people could still learn. The police department, however, was under pressure. An internal review had begun, and the officers involved were placed on temporary leave. The chief released a statement about reassessing protocols, but most people could see it was an attempt to calm public anger. Behind the scenes, lawyers began reaching out to him, suggesting legal action. He declined them all. "This was never about money," he said quietly. "You can't buy back trust." Still, as days turned into weeks, the tension didn't fade. The media attention grew and strangers began showing up. Activists, supporters, even curious onlookers. Some came with good intentions, others just wanted to take photos. He stayed inside most of the time, trying to keep life normal for his dog, who had started to sense the change in rhythm. One evening, while walking down the trail behind his house, he met an older man sitting on a bench near the stream. The man recognized him immediately. "You're the one from the news," he said, setting down his fishing rod. "I guess I am," the man replied. "They don't tell the half of it," the old fisherman said. "My brother served too. People forget what that means." He nodded slowly. "Sometimes they remember only when it's convenient." The two men talked for a while about the past, about how the world changes but stays the same in strange ways. When he left, the fisherman called out, "You did right by standing calm. Not many can do that anymore." He smiled quietly, appreciating the words more than he showed. That night, he received another call, this time from someone higher up. A retired general had seen the story and wanted to speak to him personally. They talked for nearly an hour about service, silence, and how justice sometimes comes too late but still matters. Before hanging up, the general said, You carried yourself with more honor off the field than most do in uniform. Don't let them take that from you." The word stayed with him. He sat outside afterward watching his dog chase shadows in the yard and felt a quiet sense of peace return. The world might not always be fair, but it still had people who understood. By the third week, the official investigation had reached a conclusion. The department admitted procedural errors and issued a public apology. The officers responsible were suspended pending further review. When the journalist called to tell him, he simply said, "It's enough. Let it rest now." She asked if he wanted to make a public statement, but he declined. "The story's done," he said. "Let it belong to whoever needs it." In the days that followed, the town slowly settled back into routine. The noise faded, the reporters left, and the quiet he had missed for so long began to return. He spent his mornings training with his dog again, walking through the fields, breathing in the calm that felt earned. Sometimes people still stopped by to thank him or ask for advice about their pets. He always smiled, gave a few gentle words, and went back to his quiet world. He didn't need attention, he only wanted understanding, and maybe a little respect for what love and discipline could build. But one afternoon, as the sun dipped low and the air turned cool, he sat on the porch and thought about everything that had happened. So much pain had come from one moment of misunderstanding. So much noise had grown around something that began as silence. He realized that peace was never given. It was built, protected, and sometimes defended in ways people didn't see. He reached down to pat his dog's back and whispered, "We made it through again, didn't we?" The dog lifted his head, tail thumping softly. The man smiled faintly. The world had tested him, but he hadn't let it break him. In the end, that was what mattered. Not the apologies, not the news, just the truth that he and his dog had lived by. Before going inside, he looked once more at the small flag by the gate. It was worn now from rain and wind, but still standing. He straightened it gently, then turned toward the door. Peace was fragile, yes, but he had learned how to protect fragile things his whole life. And in that quiet, steady moment, he knew he would keep protecting it, no matter how many times the world tried to take it away. Weeks passed, and the world began to move on. The story that had once filled headlines now faded behind newer stories, faster ones, louder ones. But for him, peace was returning in small, steady pieces. The house felt calm again. The air was lighter. The land around him was quiet except for the sounds of birds, wind, and his dog's soft footsteps following wherever he went. He spent his mornings walking along the edge of the woods, the leash loose in his hand, his thoughts drifting between what had been lost and what had been found. He had seen justice come in its slow, imperfect way. It hadn't brought back what he missed most, but it had brought clarity, and in its own way, that was enough. Neighbors stopped by less often now, but the ones who did came with genuine warmth, not curiosity. They talked about everyday things, the weather, their gardens, their children. No one asked about the past anymore, and he was grateful for that. It meant the town had learned to see him not as a story, but as a man again. One quiet afternoon, the journalist visited one last time. She came without her camera or recorder, just carrying a small box wrapped in plain brown paper. When he invited her to sit, she smiled gently and said, "This isn't for a story, it's for you." Inside the box was a framed photo of his old dog, the one he had lost that day, next to a medal and a note written by someone who had served with him long ago. The note read, "Some bonds are stronger than time, you taught us that." He didn't speak for a while. He just looked at the photo, running a hand over the frame. The journalist stayed silent too, understanding that some moments didn't need words. When he finally looked up, he said softly, "Thank you for keeping his story honest." She smiled. "Thank you for trusting me with it." They talked for a while after that, not about the past, but about life, small things, good things. When she left, he stood at the gate and watched her car disappear down the dirt road. Then he went back inside, placed the framed photo on a small shelf by the window, and sat for a long time in the fading light. In the weeks that followed, he began to find new rhythm in his days. He trained with his dog each morning, slow and steady, teaching commands, building trust. The young dog learned fast, alert, loyal, calm. Watching him reminded the man that healing wasn't about forgetting. It was about continuing, step by step, until peace felt natural again.